Good morning, everybody. We're still waiting on a critical mass here of climate counselors before we get going. Morning, Liz. Good morning, Dahlia. Good morning, Leslie Ann.
Good morning, David. This is Sarah Clark. I just wanted to make sure you knew I was on the line.
Oh, fantastic.
But driving.
Thanks for letting me know.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for letting me know. Good morning, Joey.
Good morning.
Good to see you. I didn't say good morning, Mark, to you as well. Good to see you, Mark.
Morning.
Morning, Michelle.
Good morning.
Multiple Michelles.
Yes, from one.
All right, so I am just looking for a critical mass of climate counselors to make sure we can get rolling here. Morning, Jared.
Good morning, everybody.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Good to see Bram in the audience as a member of the public. Thanks for joining us, Bram.
I knew that many of you were pining for me.
That's great. Nice to have you back with us. All right. Okay, if anyone wants to help me do some counting, I think we're getting awfully close here. And Kevin Grant, you might want to mute your... there you go. Okay. Secretary Moore, good morning. Okay. If folks are okay, I think we should roll forward. I'm just... Hey, David Mears, good to see you.
Secretary Clark let me know, David, that she's at an appointment with her son and may be late in joining us.
Yeah, and she's actually on the phone right now,
Okay.
which is great. But yes, I think we have critical mass here, folks. So just in the interest of everybody's time, I think let's roll forward. I just want to make sure we have enough time to like officially approve the minutes and things like that, or we could wait a moment and do that later in the meeting. I'd say let's do that later. So, okay, good morning, everyone. This is a meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. Thanks for joining. We have a special purpose today in our meeting. We're going to spend basically the entire meeting talking about Cap and Invest. And let me share the agenda right now of what we're trying to do in today's meeting. Materials are posted on the website, and if someone wants to drop those in the chat, that would be great. So the way we've thought about this agenda is sort of 3 parts, sort of 3 ways into the Cap and Invest conversation, and we'll also do some public comment in the middle of this. The first way in is an introduction, and this is in part because you all as climate counselors, and also we've got a total of 89 folks on the call today. So there's probably a pretty wide variety of sort of level of expertise on Cap and Invest. And so the first 35 minutes is really kind of what is this? It's not 101 per se, but it is sort of what are we talking about here? What are the salient characteristics of this thing we're calling Cap and Invest? So that's part one. And there's time for council questions and answers around that. And we're going to have folks from VTrans. I think Andrea Wright's going to be helping out with this, and the consultants who've been working on this report. Part two is getting into the thick of the report that was done, the technical report, and the results of that analysis. So that's where the consultants will be leading that, and then there's ample time for back and forth with the consultants, Q&A, trying to wrap our minds around all this. We're going to do some public comment at 12:30 and then take a break after that. And then we'll come back for round 3 on the discussion, which is, okay, so what does this mean for us, or you as a council, in the kinds of recommendations that you are considering putting out there in draft form in March, and then in more final form by July 1st. So this is more of the forward-looking, so what conversation about what this means for you as a council and your recommendations. That's what we're doing. And then we'll finish off with 2 things. One is we like to every time have a summary of public comments received since the last meeting in any kind of written form or any form. So Sophie's going to do that. And then we'll talk about next steps.
I'm going to try just using
Gina, your mic is open. Gina Campoli. And just confirm our next steps. March is a very busy month for us. And so we want to make sure we get a send off with that. Okay, so that's what we're doing. Before we jump into it, any quick questions about the agenda and what we're trying to do today? Okay, and I'll make sure the consultants introduce themselves in just a moment. So we know everybody who's here. And I really appreciate how many folks have joined us today. A pretty wide invite went out because there's interest in the legislature, there's interest with the treasurer's office is how it's going to react to this, and general public interest in this. And so thanks everyone for joining us. Let me just say a few words. If you don't typically join council meetings like this, a few ways that we like to work is we ask that counselors and presenters and so the resource folks, consultants, if you're able to keep your cameras on during our conversation, fantastic. If you're in a place to do that, that's great. We ask that those folks who are joining us as members of the public or other folks that aren't counselors, we ask that you keep your cameras off until we do the public comment section. And when we get to the public comment, I'll mention a little bit how we're using those, how we're doing these public comment sessions in the council. Great. I think that's it for the agenda. We do actually have a quorum now. I can see numbers. So we can do a quick approval of minutes. They are linked in the agenda. The minutes are, fairly lengthy this time because we tried to capture in the minutes all the good thinking that happened at that in-person meeting in late January. So let me just see if anybody needs a little more time to go through those. Any requests for a little more time to review the minutes? Okay. And I just want to make sure we have enough folks to do this. Jared in the background is helping me count. Looks like we've got 10 of us who are actual counselors here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I count 11. I think we're good. Okay, great. Any concerns with the minutes? Any requests for changes? Everything look good? Okay, not hearing requests for more time or requests for changes. Let's treat those minutes as approved. Thanks, everybody. All right. So let's dive into our agenda, and we're going to start with this Cap and Invest Part 1 introduction. Andrew, am I turning it over to you, and could you help me introduce the consultant folks who are here?
Yes, I will take it from here, and then we'll jump into the whole bulk of the presentation. So we've got it from here, David. And
awesome.
The only thing I'm hoping is that maybe you could share the slides.
Sure. If it's the ones online, I will happily share those.
I hope it is.
Okay. Or if someone wants to send me an email with the most recent version, even better. But yes, I will share the slides.
If that fails, David, I can share them.
Okay, great. How's that look?
That looks right. So I'll take it. Yeah,
Okay.
I think so. Yeah, so thank you, David. So I'm Andrea Wright. I'm the Environmental Policy Manager at the Agency of Transportation, and ANR and AOT are leading or led this study. So I will be sort of kicking things off here. Jane Lazorczak is the lead from the Climate Action Office, and she, I don't believe, is on quite yet, but she will be here as soon as she can. She had another commitment this morning, so she will be here for the bulk of the discussion and to help with the discussion at the end. So for now, I'll be leading things. And so for the agenda and sort of the flow of the presentation, David kind of already went through this, but we'll start with an introduction of the team. Then we'll spend just a little bit of time grounding everybody in the work. So Bram, that was, if you can mute.
Yeah, if you jump on mute real quick, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay. So we'll provide a quick background as to what has led to this exploration of a Cap and Invest program. And we'll take some time to explain what a Cap and Invest program is and how it works. And then we'll do a deep dive, reviewing the specifics of the study and going over really in quite a bit of detail the findings. So how a program might help the state meet its climate pollution reduction requirements, as well as the benefits and impacts of a program to Vermonters. And then, as David said, the third part of the discussion will provide time for questions and discussions. This is really about supporting you all so that you feel like you have the information and the data that you need to decide what recommendation may come from this in the transportation space. You can go to the next slide. So just to introduce the team, again, I'm Andrea Wright, leading the work for AOT, and the lead for ANR was Jane Lazorczak, the Climate Action Office Director. We have a really deep bench of expertise on the consultant team. Chris Porter from Cambridge Systematics serving as the program manager. And then Mark Hafstead and Molly Robinson with Resources for the Future, serving as program experts and leading the technical analysis for the study. We also have a few members that I believe are joining this call today from the state project team, and they'll help to answer any questions that you all may have later. Brian Woods from, he's an environmental analyst, and Sophie Veltrup, engagement and communications coordinator, both with the Climate Action Office. And then I think also Patrick Murphy, he was part of the state project team, and I think he is our state policy director at the Agency of Transportation. And then I also wanted to mention that this work, as called for in the legislation, has been happening in really close coordination with the state treasurer's office. So both Ashlyn Donyan and Gavin Boyles from the Treasurer P-Check's office has been involved in the work. Next slide. We had a technical advisory committee that was constituted to advise the project on the technical methods for the work. So in addition to the state team and the consultant team members, we had Vermont Climate Council members, Rich Cowart, expertise and professional experience in the design and implementation of programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We had Jared Duval providing expertise in energy and data analysis, Joey Miller, for representing statewide environmental organizations. And then we also included Sam Lash, who has energy expertise and implementation at sort of the municipal level. And she also was a member of the Just Transition Subcommittee. So she was part of our technical advisory committee to guide the work from an equity perspective. And we met 5 times throughout the project, a lot of really good presentations to the technical advisory committee, really great input on what we should be considering and how we should be considering different data and analyses along the way. So really appreciate the contributions and the way that they helped to lead this work. So just a couple of slides here. Before we really jump into the Cap and Invest, we just want to share a few of the key actions that led Vermont to this point. Let's see. So how did we get here? Clearly, you all are aware of the Global Warming Solutions Act enacted in 2020, requiring Vermont to reduce climate pollution reductions in the 2030 and 2050 targets that we had. In support of that, the 21 Climate Action Plan identified strategies to reduce emissions required by law. And the Climate Action Plan calls for the state to pursue a cap and invest program for transportation fuels. That was in the 2021 plan. In 2023, the Agency of Transportation developed a carbon reduction strategy as part of some of the funding that we got from the IIJA. And we found through that study, what we wanted to do is analyze what programs that the agency implements and what strategies both VTrans and other state entities could implement, where that would bring us in closing the gap for the 2030 and 2050 recommendations. And so we conducted this carbon reduction strategy, and what we found is that the state will fall short of its requirements in the transportation sector, even with existing adopted rules for greater vehicle efficiencies and additional investments. And so it concluded that more action is needed and that a cap and invest program was a potential strategy that could close the gap. So in response, the 2024 Transportation Bill, Act 148, called for the state to study the pros and cons of Vermont joining a cap and invest program as a potential policy to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. So the legislation called for a technical analysis and a report to be submitted with a recommendation of potentially viable options that would come from the Treasurer's office. And that report is due February 15th of this year, so just a couple of days away. And then again, of course, you all know that we'll be updating the Climate Action Plan July 1st, 2025. And this study will really inform what you all decide to put forward in that Climate Action Plan. So from here, I'll turn it over to Mark, and he will sort of give that overview of what a cap and invest program is.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Halfstead. I'm a fellow at Resources for the Future. For those of you who don't know what Resources for the Future is, we are a nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to improve environmental decision-making and lead to a healthy environment and thriving economy. So we don't take specific, as a 501(c)(3) organization, we actually don't advocate for any specific policies, but we are here just to provide our information about what a cap and invest program is and what the impacts would be. So just getting in here, we want to move through this relatively quickly. So, traditional pollution regulation tends to go to point source by point source and try to identify ways to reduce those emissions very prescriptively. CAFE standards for light duty vehicles on the left is a traditional example of how we've tried to address emissions from cars in the past. In the middle, we have medium and heavy duty trucking, which we also have federal rules for. And I know that Vermont and California and other states potentially have stricter rules on both light duty and medium duty. And then you can also think about industrial point sources, that there's also ways that you could specifically target, ways to reduce some emissions. So this is the way we kind of think about traditional pollution regulation. So scrolling down, a cap and invest program is a little different. A cap and invest program puts like an allowable limit on emissions, but it doesn't prescribe where those emissions come from. So it's not prescriptive. It sets a cap, and that cap declines over time according to the goals that the state or the federal government or the province sets. So let's go down. So basically what happens is the government sets a cap, which is a carbon budget, and they set the number of allowances equal to that cap. And then those allowances are distributed in the marketplace. But those allowances can move around. And so it doesn't mean that anyone who's emitting 5 units of emissions at the beginning will always emit 5 units. They could have incentives to reduce it to 2 units of emissions or whatnot. So it allows for by distributing the allowances in the marketplace, usually by selling them at auction, which is what we would which is what is being talked about as this plan. It creates a market incentive to reduce emissions to the cap, because if you can reduce your emissions below the price of the allowance price, you'd save money by actually reducing those emissions. But if you can't, then you buy the allowance, and that's okay because we have a cap, and that's our maximum allowable amount of emissions. Let's go down to the next one. So how do we start with the cap and invest program? It really starts with, figuring out where these emissions are coming from. So an inventory. So we want to start with an inventory of sources. We want to start with regulations on measuring and monitoring those emissions. So for example, fuel suppliers, fossil fuel suppliers, if we know how much fuel they are selling, we can convert that into what the implicit emissions that come from their customers burning those. And so from there, once you figure out your inventory sources and you're kind of measuring and monitoring, you can decide your emissions budget and decide how many allowances you want to allow. And the lower number of allowances is obviously going to make the policy more stringent. The next one. So under cap and trade programs, you do not necessarily need to cover every single source of emissions. You could cover just transportation sector. You could cover just transportation and buildings. You could add industrial sectors, or you could add the power sector. And the power sector is not, this line under here is not covering the power sector because Vermont already has a cap and trade program for the power sector, which I'll get to in a minute. And just as a fun, just a little remark, those aren't supposed to be trees. Those are supposed to be factories with emissions coming out of them. So let's go to the next one. So who are the regulated entities? Who's actually who's actually regulatorily, statutorily paying for these allowances? And it's generally not practical to regulate downstream consumers. So this is not necessarily a additional price paid by Vermont drivers or households, but it would be paid for by the suppliers who fuel those, who give those fuels to the gas stations, who give those fuels to the households. This is a practicality that allows you to regulate the upstream fuel suppliers because the actual emitters are too numerous. And so this is like an administrative issue of making sure that it's the easiest way to make sure that you can cover the most amount of emissions. So the way the market works is there's an allowance market. And let's say that company A and company B both start with 5 units of allowances, but company B can invest in some type of technology to reduce its emissions. And let's say that our cap is 7 units just for this 2 company example. As the price increases, company B is more incentivized because it has a better opportunity to reduce its emissions. So it'll invest in some new technologies that are actually cheaper than the allowance price, and then it will only need 2 units versus the 5 units. And so this allowance market by putting a price on emissions, really determines like where and when emissions reductions occur. And it allows the market to decide where those reductions occur versus a prescriptive regulation that would say both companies need to reduce their emissions by 1.5 units so that it goes from 10 to 7. So if it's cheaper for company B to do it than company A, that's okay. And that's what the market is trying to accomplish. So we can go to the next slide. So thinking about like what is the cap and invest program actually going to do for Vermont? So let's scroll down. So as I mentioned earlier, Vermont already has a cap and invest for the electricity sector through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which has been around for many, many years. It covers most of the Northeast states. Pennsylvania is a question mark. There's some pending litigation. New Jersey has been in and out, or out then in. But this covers power sector emissions for the electricity sector, and the value of those allowances in Vermont are invested in improving energy efficiency. We also have other states that are doing cap and invest. So you have the Western Climate Initiative, which is a combination of California and Quebec, and Washington State with its own cap and invest program, excuse me, is looking to link with them. We also have a program under development in New York State. It's called the New York Cap and Invest Program, NYCI. They are in the process of developing rules for what that program is going to look like. So your neighbors are already doing these types of policies more broadly than the power sector. We can go down. So, one of the things we want to ask is like how, what are the pros and cons of a cap and invest program, and how is this going to affect Vermonters? So the benefits are through auctioning those allowances to the polluters, that creates money that can be invested in climate action. That can include helping to improve energy efficiency programs. So trying to invest in providing heat pumps. It can invest in resilience. It can invest in trying to expand EV charging networks or incentives for uptake of more EVs. It can create more jobs in the climate workforce. So I live in New Mexico. New Mexico is a very large oil producer and gas producer. Vermont is not. And so like Vermont would be a net winner from creating these types of policies that transition away from traditional fossil fuels, because it's going to create more jobs in the climate workforce relative to jobs from the fossil fuel industry. It can also improve health and the environment. There are a lot of pollutants that are associated with burning fossil fuels that are local air pollutants. So PM 2.5, sulfur dioxide, et cetera. And these have bad health effects. And so by reducing our fossil fuel combustion through this policy, this can improve the Vermont health and the environment. And like lastly, I'll just say that we know that we are going to try to come with some type of policies to address climate action, and sometimes there's a lot of uncertainty there because businesses don't quite know what policy could be coming down. By setting this cap and formalizing a timeline for emissions reductions, this improves decision-making for businesses by increasing the certainty of they know what is happening and they will react accordingly. When it's uncertain, sometimes some businesses might try to hedge their bets. On the con side, certainly that we do expect higher prices for conventional fossil fuels. So as I said earlier, we want to tax the upstream suppliers rather than the actual consumers, but we expect those prices, those costs to be passed on to to users. And so just to give a general rule of thumb is that $1 carbon price is equivalent to a 1 cent tax on gasoline, give or take, a little less than 1 cent. So a $100 carbon price would raise the price of gas by $1, approximately. And then the other kind of impact, potential negative impact, we think is there's border impacts with non-participating neighbors. So consumers could choose to fill up outside of Vermont. Businesses could decide to move their production to non-participating neighbors that don't have as strict rules. And there are ways to alleviate that, and we'll get to that in a second. So let's move on to the next slide. And so at the end of the day, you know, the idea is not to make this burdensome, but to make it, you know, to think about affordability and affordability for Vermonters. And there's different ways we can, the program could be designed to make sure the program is affordable for Vermonters. And so the first kind of basic one is basically just set an upper limit on the emissions price. You can't go above a certain price. Another way is to take some of the revenues and target those proceeds to ensure equity. To target some of those revenues to households that are more affected by the program. And this is common in different types of programs. So for example, British Columbia has a carbon tax, and they give checks to households every quarter to help offset the impacts of the price impacts of the policy. It makes it easier to switch to clean energy, which over time has, you know, lower kind of variable costs. And then for at-risk industries, we can allocate emissions allowances to those industries in a way that incentivizes them to keep producing in Vermont. And they've done this in California. They've done this in the EU. So, you know, there are ways that that the program can be designed to make sure that it's affordable. Let's go to the next slide. Should wrap up here soon. You know, as part of a cap and invest program, you know, there's the cap, but then there's the invest, and the investing is really into like clean energy and efficiency programs, incentivizing all types of different ways to help households reduce their greenhouse gas footprint. And so, you know, these ways could be, some people might choose weatherization, some people might choose heat pumps, some people might choose solar, some people might choose EV. But the program doesn't necessarily tell you where you have to invest. And that's, I think, where the market people will have these incentives, and they'll get to choose what's most cost effective for them. So just wrapping up here, Cap and Invest 101, you know, a declining emissions cap provides certainty about emissions reductions because there is a cap, and that cap declines over time. That price that's caused by the allowance market provides a signal to influence future investments. So again, if the price is higher than the cost of these new investments, you will make the new investments to reduce your emissions. The proceeds from auctioning those allowances can be reinvested. They can be reinvested through payments to low-income households. They can be reinvested into energy efficiency, and they can be reinvested in other ways that are going to improve Vermont's resilience in response to climate change. And then finally, I'll just say that we do not view Cap and Invest as a substitute to other types of policies. We really think it complements and supports other pollution reduction policies. And so it should not be necessarily viewed as one or the other type of policy. And so with that, I will wrap up and we will transition to the results.
Oops, I'm on mute. Sorry. Thanks, Mark. That's great. And I think before we jump into the results, I think let's pause here. Counselors, for those of you, this is a good opportunity to ask Mark or Andrea or other people questions about the sort of overall logic of this before we jump into the findings. So let me just pause. Counselors, any thoughts? And those of you who are experts in this as well, because we have some experts among our counselors, and you'd like to complement anything that Mark or Andrea said, feel free to jump in as well, in terms of the sort of overall basics of why we're looking at this and what this thing is. Any comments, questions? Secretary Moore?
Yeah, thank you for that excellent overview. Both of my questions are sort of along the same theme, which is if Vermont is to join a regional program, just wondering, do we have control, like where we have control and where we don't? Would allowances necessarily stay in Vermont, or if we join WCI and the lowest cost opportunities are all in California, is there a scenario where we're not seeing emissions reductions in Vermont, even though Vermonters are paying into a system, recognizing it's a global good, but also have legal requirements here? And then the other question was, you'd noted about the ability to set an upper limit on the emissions price. And again, is that something we as a state can do, or is that sort of established in this broader marketplace?
Both great questions. By linking to other markets, you're increasing flexibility and trying to find the lowest cost options. Those low cost options could be outside of Vermont's jurisdiction. And so there is a possibility that Vermont would be quote unquote importing allowances from the other jurisdiction, and essentially paying for reductions in other states. So that is definitely a concern when it comes to state level, legal targets. And I think there are ways to address it that are maybe a little too complicated for me to just jump into now, but that is a concern. And so great question. And then the second one is, I'm not a legal expert. I don't talk with the New York folks or the California folks. In terms of whether or not Vermont could set its own price limit that's different from the price limit that exists in, say, the Western Climate Initiative, I'm unclear on that. That is something I think is, from an economics perspective, is totally feasible. It's just a matter of negotiations with how those program linkages would work.
Thanks, Mark.
I'll add on to that, Mark. It's Brian Woods from the agency. It's like, if you want the allowances to be fungible across the entire trading region, and one jurisdiction establishes a lower ceiling price than the other, then you get back to the Secretary's original question, where there'll be an excess demand for the lowest price allowances to comply anywhere.
Right. So there's some challenges in that. Yeah. Rich?
Well, I have a comment and a question. My comment is, and partly an observation about the last question. If reductions occur in a multi-state system, if reductions occur in New York, let's say, because they're lower cost, then that would tend to lower the clearing price of allowances in the system as a whole, because you're finding the lowest cost places to reduce. I assume that's correct.
That is correct. And so that's one of the reasons why Washington State wants to link with California is that and we have an RFF study coming out probably in the next week or so on Washington State. I'm not an author of that. But it shows that Washington linking with California would lower the overall allowance price in Washington.
And then the complement to that is that it may be true that the emission reductions would be occurring, in this case, in New York, but the revenue from the sale of allowances would still be held by Vermont, according to whatever fraction of allowance sales are given to Vermont in the first place, as in RGGI. And then the opportunity to invest that revenue in Vermont still lies with Vermont, even if the reductions physically are occurring somewhere else. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And now a question for you, Mark, that at one point you said that one of the advantages of cap and trade is that the obligated parties with the opportunity to reduce emissions at the lower cost will have an incentive to do that. And that certainly makes sense if you're comparing, for example, one industrial facility against another. But in the case of, let's say, gasoline or fuel oil, I don't really see that the opportunities to reduce emissions are upstream. I don't expect Irving to reduce its emissions because of cap and trade. The opportunities to reduce emissions in the transportation sector are going to be at the vehicle level. And so the important aspect of a cap program that we might be thinking about, it seems to me, are at home in Vermont. And that's why the invest portion of the cap and invest is so important if we were to go down this route. Is that not correct? I just don't see Irving Oil, like subsidizing electric vehicles in Vermont so that they would have to pay lower carbon charges. That's not how it works.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this gets into kind of upstream versus downstream, like where you actually put the tax versus who's actually incentivized to change their behavior. And as I said earlier, you tax upstream because you're trying to lower your administrative burden. We already tax gasoline at the wholesale rack. We don't tax it at the individual. Gasoline taxes are not collected at gas stations. They're collected at the wholesale level. And those charges are passed down to the retailers. And so what's going to happen is that this policy would, through this pass-through, would increase the price of gasoline. If the price is $20, 20-cent increase in gasoline. Is that a lot? We've seen a lot of fluctuations in gas prices over the years. And we do have evidence that people respond to changes in fuel prices. When fuel prices were really high, you saw more efficient vehicle uptake. There's actually evidence from Canada that people are 3 times more responsive to changes in gasoline prices caused by taxes than they are just random fossil fuel fluctuations. So we have evidence that people are price responsive to changing gasoline prices in terms of the way they purchase their vehicles, in terms of the way they drive their vehicles. Let's say a household has 2 vehicles, one's less energy efficient, one's more energy efficient. Changes in gasoline prices might affect how much they drive one versus the other. And that actually has emissions benefits, but it's a subtle change. People aren't necessarily having to buy a new vehicle. and they can still change the way they behave, the way they schedule their errands to respond to that. And we've seen that in the past. And so that's where we expect to see some of these price responsiveness. But I would also agree that the investment is a key part of this. I'm not going to disagree with that.
And just to jump in real quick, the fuel suppliers do have at least one lever they can pull, which is to blend with renewable fuels. They can reduce their emissions that way.
Thanks, Chris. Okay. So that may be a good pivot for us to go to you, Chris, for the study results. Unless counselors, anything else you want to, sort of general questions you want to ask before we jump over to Chris? Okay. Chris, I'm happy to share my screen, or if it's more comfortable for you to do it yourself, whichever.
Yeah,
Hey, David,
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, Carrick, sorry. I missed your hand.
No, that's because I was late to the party. Sorry. Mark, thank you very much. It's just a quick question. It's based on some work we're doing about the impact of the on energy tariffs and the like. So I'm just one point I saw on the slide. It talked about the positive job impact in the climate workforce, and I wonder if you considered the impacts on the business. Is that a net when you say increase in jobs in the climate workforce? Is there a decrease in jobs in other industries, or those that are more impacted, or what's the net of that, please?
Great question. I've done a lot of work on employment and jobs and environmental policy. We tend to find that it's a reallocation. So you have more climate workforce jobs, but you have less fossil jobs. But for a state like Vermont, I think the net would be positive because, Vermont is Vermont doesn't produce oil and gas the way that New Mexico produces oil and gas. And so those effects would be, the effect in my state, New Mexico, would be very different than the effects in Vermont on that. And so what I was trying to caveat was that, yes, there are job gains, there are job losses, but for a state like Vermont that is relatively clean already, doesn't produce these types of fuels, imports those fuels actually, that this could be a net winner.
And just sorry, Mark, to jump in. When Chris presents that slide, Chris, can you make sure you say whether those figures are net or sort of gross?
Sure. I'll talk about that because we did look at job impacts in the study.
Hey, thank you.
You're referencing a slide that Chris is going to show towards the end of this next set of slides. But I really appreciate the question, Kara, because I had the same question when I looked at those slides too.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much.
All right.
Anyhow, David, yeah, if you're willing to share your screen, that'd be great.
Yeah, no problem. Just give me a sec. I'll pull it back up.
Cool. Okay, and you can just jump right to the next slide. Yeah. Okay. So this was a study that was required by the legislature in the transportation bill of 2024, and to look at the pros, cons, cost, and benefits of participating in a regional cap and invest program. And we went into this study just assuming that Vermont would not go on its own with cap and invest, because we're a small state, take a lot of work to create our own program, our own market. So, we're looking at the state would join with another program. The Western Climate Initiative is already up and running. The New York program is still under development. So we'll talk about some of the pros and the cons and the risks of those two options. The study also asked us to look at a clean transportation fuel standard and how that might work with or complement a cap and invest. And so I will talk about that as well. Next slide, yeah. So yeah, we looked at quantitative estimates of emission reductions, how much revenue would be generated that could be reinvested, benefits, impacts in terms of household costs, jobs, and other metrics, what resources the state would need to administer a program, what the timeline would be. And that information is all going to the Treasurer's Office report that was submitted on January 31st. And the Treasurer's Office will make a recommendation to the legislature about a cap and invest program. Next slide. We did conduct some public involvement along the way. In early October, we held 2 virtual public meetings to introduce the concept, very much like what Mark just presented with you, and answer questions and solicit input. And then we also held 3 focus groups with representatives of industries that might have to be obligated and pay for allowances, as well as Vermont's business community in general, as well as environmental and community-based organizations, including those representing equity interests. Next slide. So we looked at really 2 sets of program options. Again, the first being which program to join, and the second being which sectors to include. A lot of the motivation came from the transportation study that showed that transportation was not going to hit its obligations, but so we're looking at the option of just covering transportation, but we also wanted to look at an expanded program that could cover other fuels, residential, commercial, and industrial heating fuels, also known as thermal emissions. And then a third option, which would also include industrial process emissions. And those would be a small number of point sources in Vermont, maybe a half a dozen that emit significant amounts of emissions that are not fuel-based. So the Western Climate Initiative, as we mentioned, already up and running for over 10 years. We've got a functioning platform, demonstrated track record. The New York Climate Initiative has not been finalized. They are looking to hopefully publish a draft rule this spring. The earliest start year would be 2027. They're also looking at just starting with a reporting year where the businesses are not obligated, but they need to track and measure and report their emissions, which would be sort of getting your feet in the water before you jump into the swimming pool all the way. Also, I would just want to mention, I think everyone is aware of the clean heat standard that would potentially apply to residential and commercial sectors in Vermont. And, so we did want to kind of consider how that would relate or, either be complementary or not with that program. Next slide. So starting with, we actually don't have perfect information on what allowance prices will look like in the future under either program that Vermont might join. And I'm starting off with allowance prices because that's really what also drives the emission reductions, the reinvestment opportunities, and every other benefit that comes out of the program. So how much of those allowances is going to end up costing? So we do have a price history with the Western Climate Initiative. Right, it started off around $10 per ton of carbon back when it started, and is now up trading around $30 per ton. So you can see we evaluated what we call a medium scenario around that price. That's the current option that would be available to Vermont. We looked at a low price scenario. We understand that New York is potentially looking at a lower price cap that might start in the range of $10 to $15 per ton or something just lower. So, we looked at that scenario, and then we also looked at the high scenario, and that's the consistent with the current price cap under the Western Climate Program, which has not been reached, but currently would be around $60 per ton and inflates in the future according to a formula that they've set. And as Mark mentioned, the effects on the price of fuel, the low price would start off with a fossil fuel price impact of maybe around 10 cents per gallon, the medium in the range of 30 cents per gallon, and high by 60 cents or more And then, again, potentially going up from there over time. But just again, prices can go up and down in these markets. So, there's nothing certain here. Next slide. So we had to start off with a baseline forecast, and this is not all the emissions that Vermont produces. It is only the subset that might be covered in the sectors, the transportation emissions, residential, commercial, and industrial fuels, and then process emissions, which is about 80% of Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions. And the transportation, right, is about 40%. The thermal is about 34%, and the industrial is about 6%. So we developed some sort of what happens if things continue without the Cap and Invest program, and assume that emissions from the thermal and industrial sector continue to sort of decrease slowly per unit of economic output based on sort of national trends. And then we also looked at the transportation emissions and how that would be affected by the advanced clean cars and trucks rules that Vermont has already adopted. And I also, the other thing on this graph is the circles show the emissions that we estimate Vermont would be required to meet for these sectors under the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so the transportation is the hollow circle if you compare it with that gray bar there, you can see there's a gap projected being higher than actual by about 0.7 million metric tons. You can also see if we add transportation and thermal, again, the gap between the filled in circle and just the bottom of that green line, also a gap in 2030 and 2050. One other technical point, which seems minor, but it's actually important when we're modeling just a couple years out. The Global Warming Solutions Act sets the 2030 limit. It's really for calendar year 2029, because it says the limit has to be reached by January 1st, 2030. So we are modeling emissions for 2029 and 2049. And again, 2029 is coming up real fast. So that's going to be important. Next slide. So we're now showing a few charts with projected emissions for the covered sectors in 2029. We looked at 9 scenarios. We looked at the combinations of 3 price levels, low, medium, and high, and then 3 levels of sectoral coverage. Again, starting with transportation, the blue bar to the left, all the way through industrial processes, covering all of those, and the green bar on the right. And the black line is what we project will happen in 2029 with no further action, almost 5 million metric tons of emissions. The bottom line is the target or the requirement based on the Global Warming Solutions Act levels and how they're allocated to these sectors. That's just over 4 million metric tons. And in this scenario, we looked at a program that started reinvesting in 2028. And we also looked at a couple of different options for how the proceeds are used. At the worst case, in terms of emissions, we take all the proceeds and we return them directly as dividends to consumers, for example, tax or utility bill rebates. Or we invest them in other activities like climate resilience that don't actually reduce emissions, but still provide benefits. We looked at a couple of other scenarios where we increase the amount of proceeds that are invested in emissions reducing activities, which should further the emission reductions. And as you can see, this is also the 2029 emissions with investing all of your proceeds. And you can see even under this case, we don't quite get to the 2030 target, even with a high price. The low price closes the gap a little bit. The medium price closes it some more. The high price closes it even more. But we're not all the way at the 2030 level. And you can also see that covering more sectors is likely to reduce more emissions than just covering the transportation sector. We looked specifically at just transportation. If you were to only cover that, Again, so we have that 2.74 million metric tons baseline, 2.05 is the proportional sector level target. And again, you can see that the cap and invest closes the scenario, but not all the way. You can also see that the reinvestment doesn't help that much. And the reason is because we are just starting to see the effects of reinvestment in 2029. If we have a program that even optimistically starts in 2027, the money starts to get spent in 2028, people start to make investments. It's going to take time for those investments to see benefits. So, really need to look at more of the out years before those reinvestments really have effects. Next slide. So this is looking over time at the range of emissions that we might see under the different scenarios. And so the question here is, if we're not reaching that 2030 level in 2029, when are we reaching it? And you can see here that it happens sometime between calendar year 2030 under the best case scenario and 2035 under the low price scenario covering the transportation sector only. So, we do expect Vermont to get to that level. It's just probably going to be a few years late, even with the cap and invest. You can see also going out to 2050 and this is all with reinvesting half of your proceeds in emissions reducing activities. You can see that we're not at the 2050 target either, even under the best case scenario. Next slide. So this is what happens in 2050, actually calendar year 2049. If we ramp it up all the way, which means taking all the proceeds, we take off a few percent to cover administrative costs, but after that, we invest all the proceeds in emissions reducing activities. And then the high price scenario does get us to that target established under the Global Warming Solutions Act. The other scenarios don't quite get us there. I will say there is a lot of uncertainty as to what happens when you look out 25 years, a lot of uncertainties about economics, about growth, about technology. So, this is all, should be taken with a grain of salt, but this is the long-term projection. Next slide. Okay, moving on to other benefits and impacts of the program. This is what we estimate would be the auction proceeds in 2030 at the different price levels and the different sectoral coverages. Somewhere at the low price, the state would raise somewhere between 30 and 60 million. Could be 90, or it could be upwards of 180 million under the high price scenario. Somewhere in between for the medium, of course. More additional revenue if you cover residential and commercial fuels. The industrial adds a little bit more. And just for comparison, so this is a substantial amount of money that could be returned to Vermonters through dividends or invested in clean energy and resilience. So just for comparison, the Efficiency Vermont program that's funded by RGGI and utilities is annual program budget is around 50 million. So even the low price scenario would just about double that. All right, so we were talking about jobs earlier. So this, we took some estimates that were developed from the Transportation and Climate Initiative study a few years ago using the Regional Economic Models, Inc., or the REMI model of the regional economy. And that looked specifically at transportation sector effects and reinvestment of auction proceeds into clean transportation. But we expanded it and said, what if the similar effects are seen for covering other sectors? And we looked at both the impacts of increased prices to consumers and businesses, as well as the benefits of reinvestment that was returned to those businesses and consumers. And the overall effect was a net positive change of about, if we kind of scale the results based on the price level, it's a net positive change of somewhere between 80 and 140 jobs under the low price scenario, or a few hundred jobs under the medium or high price scenario. That's good that it's a net positive. It is a small relative to the size of Vermont's workforce. It's less than 0.2%. But still, again, positive. Okay, moving on to household level impacts. And there's a lot going on this slide. So this was something that we did with Resources for the Future. They have an incidence model to look at how different households benefit. What we have 5 income quintiles. That means starting with number 1, that's the lowest 20% of households in terms of their income. Income quintile 5 is the highest 20%. This is all for the medium price scenario, covering the transportation and thermal sectors and reinvesting 50% of the proceeds in energy efficiency. And so that is what's going on here is so first of all, consumers experience some net increases or decreases in certain spending on certain fuel types. And this is, again, average across all households. So you can see here that yellow bar, the electricity, people are paying more for electricity, not because it's more expensive, because households are switching to electricity from fossil fuels. They're paying less for fossil fuels, motor gasoline, natural gas, and other heating fuels, home heating oil. Those are the green and blue bars, and the purple. And that's because they are either reducing their consumption because they're driving less, or they're simply switching to those cleaner energy sources, electric vehicles, and heat pumps, etc. You can also see that there are some rebates and efficiency incentives. The rebates are, if it's just a direct dividend to consumer, the efficiency incentives, that's the red and the gray. And what we've done in this case is we've actually targeted those directly to the lower to middle income households in the first 3 income quintiles. And the net result of this is that households on average are spending, it's maybe a little hard to see, but that bar, somewhere between $500 and $700 less per year on energy costs. And the higher income households are spending a little bit less, but we're assuming that they don't get the rebates to the same extent that the lower income quintiles do. So this is one way of looking at the cost effects. If you go on to the next slide, there's another way.
Chris, just to be triple clear, like the fact that it's negative is quote unquote a positive, right? Because it's less spending, right?
Yes, it's a cost.
So no one gets upside down on the graph. It's this is savings as you go lower in the bar.
Right. Now, some of that, I'm anticipating your questions here, but if you go on to the next slide, that's assuming that households are able to reduce their consumption of fossil fuels. Not every household will be able to do that. And so what we looked at a case where a household is unable to switch to a cleaner energy source. They're unable to drive less or otherwise reduce their heating or other energy consumption. What happens to those households? So this is just from the price effect of the fossil fuels. And you can see that the costs for gasoline go up anywhere between $50 and $300 or $400 a year. Heating fuel costs also go up. So the net impact on the fuel costs is anywhere between like $200 and $500 a year, depending on your income, since higher income households spend more on fuels. But we can see here, again, what we've done is we are refunding, giving direct rebates to those households in the lower income quintiles. That's the black or the gray bar. You get a little over $200 back a year. And what that means is that the lowest incomes are actually made whole in the sense that they're not paying any net additional cost. And even the middle income quintile, just a very, very small cost. So this is making this way of redistributing proceeds helps to avoid some of avoid the impacts on the households that are really least able to pay. And you know, again, every household is going to be in a different situation, but this shows what you know, the kind of the average impacts would be. Next slide. And so, you know, again, just trying to sort of summarizing this, putting it into maybe, yeah, numbers. You know, this maximum impact that we're showing on the left is just the change in fossil fuel costs under the different price scenarios if you don't reduce your consumption or switch fuels. The typical impact is inclusive of dividends, rebates, but not changing your fuel consumption. Again, you know, average household is going to see a very slight benefit there. And then what we call on the right, the average is inclusive of everything, including any sort of reduced consumption that comes from that price effect. And then you can see a much more significant cost reduction. And again, this is just looking at the lower 60% of households. Okay, I know there's a lot. We've got one more way of looking at household costs, and this is looking at a household that has an oil furnace that's reaching the end of its life and is looking at the options of replacing it with another oil furnace that's going to burn oil for another 25 years, or a heat pump, which is going to use clean electricity. That heat pump is maybe going to cost an additional $8,000 or so. Could vary a lot depending on, you know, do they need an electric panel upgrade and how big the house is, that sort of thing. But, you know, there's an upfront cost. But they save money every year because the electricity costs are cheaper than the oil costs. And after about 4 years, they are break even. And after that, they're saving money. And after 25 years, they've actually saved quite a bit of money with that heat pump. So not every household, of course, can afford that upfront cost. So this is where, you know, to make it feasible for people, we need to offer rebates, even just low or zero interest loans that could be paid back over time to close the gap. Right now, the maximum rebate in Vermont is about $2,000. That helps a little bit, but it doesn't really cover the incremental costs. So a Cap and Invest could offer more resources to cover rebates and or low interest loans to really help even the lower and middle income households take advantage of this and realize cost savings over time, as well as reducing their emissions. Next slide. So just a few other metrics here. The social benefits of carbon emissions. This is kind of an abstract concept, but this is all the economic damages that are estimated to result sort of globally from carbon emissions and the dollars per ton of emissions. And just, you know, the point here is that it's a significant value in terms of millions of dollars of benefits, even under the low price scenario. Next slide. We looked at health benefits also based on a study for the Transportation and Climate Initiative program. And the health benefits we consider come from lower emissions especially from diesel trucks that you know, have health impacts, as well as more physical activity, walking and biking, and transit from investing in improved travel options. So that and that helps reduce healthcare costs because people are more active and more fit, as well as, you know, breathing cleaner air. And so we estimated somewhere between 7 and 24 avoided deaths per year, anywhere, you know, a few tens of avoided cases of childhood asthma, and then upwards of $50 million value of those health benefits as a result of implementing cap and trade, and then reinvesting some of those proceeds in emission reductions. Next slide. So even the program has net financial benefits to the state, but it is not free to implement. The state will need to hire additional staff and or contract work to administer the program. And there's a fair amount of work. They need to update regulations, you know, enforce participation, distribute proceeds, and kind of monitor and report on how everything is working. So we looked at some experience from Quebec on their staffing levels, scaled them to the size of Vermont, and also looked at there's some costs to actually use the Western Climate Initiative emissions trading platform. Presumably there'd be some cost with using New York as well if we joined with them. And somewhere between $2 and $3 or $4 million a year probably, which could be up to 4 to 6% of the proceeds for the low price scenario. Be somewhat less for the medium to high price scenario, probably a lower ratio of administrative costs to proceeds. Washington State caps their administrative costs at 5%. We did look at, I think for Vermont, for a smaller state, it might be a sort of a higher fixed cost and a higher percentage. So to be very conservative, we assumed that 10% of the proceeds were set aside for program administration, when we did the reinvestment analysis. Next slide. So, we tried to put all these metrics together in kind of a summary table. So basically, we start off we've got an emissions gap between the 2030 limit and what we're projected. We close it with the higher the price, and the more sectoral coverage, the more we close it. We don't reach it all the way. We do reach that limit somewhere between 2031 or 2030 and 2035. Again, the higher price means more auction proceeds, scaling, to a higher impact per household, again, higher fossil fuel prices, but also higher benefits in terms of dividends and fuel switching benefits. And of course, the jobs, the social cost of carbon, the value of health benefits all scale accordingly. Also, this is maybe a good time to point out again that right now, the medium price scenario is really the only one that's sort of available to Vermont in terms of a program to join. Depending on what New York does, maybe a low price scenario will be available to us. And, again, the high price scenario is maybe what could happen under Western Climate Initiative, but hasn't happened yet, if that market got particularly tight. Okay, so that's a lot about Cap and Invest. We were supposed to also look at low carbon fuel standards. So hang on with me for just a few more slides on this. Low carbon fuel standard is a standard that reduces the intensity of carbon emissions per unit of fuel, and it applies to fuel suppliers. So it's a little bit different than a Cap and Invest, which sets a cap on total emissions. This is a cap on the unit of emissions per fuel. It does cover life cycle emissions. That includes out-of-state emissions associated with fuel production. So, and it does create an internal credit market for fuel suppliers where producers of low carbon fuels can sell credits to producers of higher carbon fuels. And so what that does is it sort of creates its own internal market to incentivize biofuels, electricity, other low carbon fuels. It's not something that's directly seen by the consumers. But California, Oregon, Washington, and Quebec have all implemented some form of low carbon fuel standard. And so they are viewing it as complementary to the Cap and Invest program. So we looked at the same evaluation criteria, not at the same level of detail, but just to give a sense of how it might affect Vermont. So just in this example, if Vermont were to set a 10% reduction in carbon intensity on transportation fuels, that would reduce emissions by about 0.2 to 0.3 million metric tons in 2030, which, as you may recall, was about, maybe a third of the gap that we're trying to close. Some of those emission reductions might be out of state. The revenue generation, there'd be no net impact on revenue to the state. There'd be some, except, a little bit of administrative costs. It wouldn't necessarily affect the allowances prices directly under the Cap and Invest, but it could reduce those prices. by providing another emission reduction mechanism and incentive for fuel suppliers. Like if they have more incentive to switch to renewable fuels, they would also need fewer carbon allowances. There have been some studies. California found that the current impact of their program is about 10 cents per gallon. Over the long term, that's actually supposed to decrease. Electricity prices decrease because electricity producers can sell those credits and reduce their own costs. And then you're also introducing, you're developing other types of fuels that over time, can bring down the costs on renewable fuels. Next slide. In terms of economic effects, Washington found a small gain if they were to adopt this, with electrification jobs gaining more than petroleum sector losses. Again, that may vary by state, but we'd expect something similar in Vermont. Again, household impacts, modest impacts really related to those changes in fuel costs that might be seen. Some additional health benefits if we reduced emissions, especially from diesel fuel. And then there would be some administrative costs. And right now, there is no neighboring state that has a low carbon standard that could be linked to Vermont. So we'd be going out on our own. And so that might be more burdensome, which is an important consideration for the state. And then in terms of timeline, it could be implemented at the same time as Cap and Invest, but it could also be independent. And it would create another obligation, another reporting program for fuel suppliers. So that's also not just the state, but on the private sector would create some additional complications. So just wanted to go back and hit some of the input that we heard from stakeholders. The potentially obligated entities and the other businesses, we did hear some support from the renewable fuel industry. It would clearly benefit them. There were some concerns over cost impacts to fuels and impacts on business growth, administrative requirements. We did hear some preference for a single emission regulation program over multiple programs covering multiple sectors. And there were some questions about small fuel distributors, how they would be impacted, distributors who cross state borders. We think those things can be managed, but again, just I think people wanted sort of a better understanding of what the program would mean for them. Next slide. From the environmental and community groups, we heard a lot of support for the program as a cost-effective way to reduce emissions, and also to provide a pool of resources for reinvesting in emission reductions. And especially with the shift in federal policy, we're not really seeing other funding sources out there to support the shift to clean energy. So this is maybe the best opportunity for that. And there was a really important, we heard, to support equity, make sure that rural and low-income Vermonters are not left behind or overburdened as we transition to clean energy, and just wanting to involve people in how the funds are used and making sure that everybody understands why it's important. And again, the public meeting, it was less interactive, but we did have questions again about how the programs worked in other states and some of the mechanics of the program and how consumers can find out more about how to take advantage of any of the benefits. Next slide. So just summarizing what we found, yes, the program would definitely support additional progress towards meeting those emissions requirements, but probably not going to hit the 2030 level, more like the early to mid 2030s. Even 2050 is going to be hard to hit even with Cap and Invest. And again, these program choices, again, which some of them are not really choices that we have for sure yet, like New York, joining New York, we just don't know if that's going to be a possibility yet. But some of those program choices are going to affect how large the emission benefits are and the everything else that sort of flows from that. Next slide. So yeah, and the benefits and impacts under the programs that are likely to be out there would potentially increase fossil fuel prices by 10 to 30 cents per gallon initially, and likely more over time. But again, you know, depending on how those proceeds are used, and that's something that's up to the legislature, I should mention, as to they have the authority to spend money. So the legislature has to decide how the proceeds would be used in general. But those could be returned to consumers and businesses and really kind of offset those costs, especially for the lower income households if those are targeted. And you know, there's going to be other benefits that Vermonters see as well that should make the state a more attractive place and maybe offset some of the concerns about the fuel price impacts. Next slide. Again, just mentioning, you know, with Nikki still being under development, you know, we think the earliest practical start date for either program is likely to be 2028. California has already signaled they're not really looking to take in other participants until at least 2027. Vermont needs its own timeline to actually establish the program rules and get that up and running. But it's potentially, the state could potentially start with a reporting only year in 2027, just to get people in, you know, figuring out how it works. And the other unknown here is that whichever program we join, the program participants would need to approve the terms of Vermont's participation. They have expressed openness, interest in having other people join, but again, just the details need to be hammered out. And then again, once the program is running, also just, you know, getting that money flowing into a reinvestment, getting it actually in the hands of consumers and putting in heat pumps, putting in electric vehicle charging equipment, that's really going to start to generate benefits in 2029, 2030, and just kind of accelerating over time. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation. So, you know, again, look forward to taking questions and comments. I'll turn it back to David.
Thanks, Chris. That's a very thorough presentation. I really appreciate it. I want to do a little bit of Q&A, and then I really try to respect the time we have on our agenda for public comment. Right now, the time is 12:30, we said. So we'll start around 12:33 or something, but let's do a quick round of questions, do some public comment, take a break, come back, and then do a deep dive on questions and the implications for this for you all. So counselors, that was a lot. Yeah, I was going to say, Secretary Clark, I saw your hand halfway through. And so thanks for bringing it back up. Well, over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, my question has evolved a little bit, but maybe I'll ask the newer question, which when you look at the implementation costs of this proposal, how are we contemplating funding those implementation costs? Would it be a budget request? I'm assuming the timing of the revenue generated would not align with needing to fund implementation costs.
Yeah, that's a great question. Right, initially, right, because that first auction is going to be, you know, at least 3 months after the program is started, but you need to staff it up to get the rules in place, to get things going. So yeah, I imagine there would be need to be some sort of budget request. I'm not sure exactly how the state would handle it. And Mark, I don't know if you know how other states have dealt with that, or Brian or anybody.
Yeah, in the Reggie program, when they stood it up, actually, NYSERDA funded that on behalf of all the states.
As in the state of New York. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Brian.
No, I'm sorry for the acronym.
Yeah. And Mark, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I know that in Canada, they actually advance funded dividend payments. So they actually gave dividend payments to people before they actually raised any revenue. I'm not sure how they finance that, but that was one of the ways they were trying to address criticisms of the program, was to give people the money before they got the higher fuel prices.
Thanks, Mark. Okay. Counselors, other questions, reactions that you have seeing that detail from Chris. Julie?
I have a couple of questions. I'm struggling a little bit, I guess, Chris, with the slides 36, 37, and 38, where I feel like, I guess, first want to make sure I'm confirming the slides on the numbers presented on 36 and 37 are just sort of the operational costs, correct? Like the fossil fuel costs of a year, not the replacement cost of somebody needing to install a furnace or purchase an electric vehicle. So when you're talking about household expenditures, that's just in the fuel portion, not the equipment portion of what the household would see.
Yeah, I believe that's correct. I would need to verify that with kind of resources for the future person who did the analysis, but yeah.
Hi, Chris. This
yeah,
is
hi, Molly.
Molly.
Right.
So the categories I think you're asking about here are the motor vehicles category and the efficiency category on this chart, the purple and the red. Those are specific, on the incentive side for motor vehicles and for heat pump efficiency. I think there's not an increased expenditure category for people that have transitioned but are that kind of additional marginal cost. I don't know, Dallas, if you're on. I know Dallas is on, but
I know we know, but it slipped. I wasn't prepared for the question, so we can come back to you on that. I'm sorry not to know right off the top.
Yeah, thanks. No, and I appreciate that the slides 38, I think, and 39 start to get at that a little bit, or maybe, nope, I'm looking at those keep going, Chris, if you would. It's the line graphs where you're starting to show where you cross this, right, for the incremental cost. The fuel savings is obviously real, but I think our biggest challenge is figuring out how we get people over this upfront investment hump to enjoy those savings. And I just have some concerns that having that be how we bring these things together a little more closely, so that we're not losing sight of the fact that you only get the savings once you've made that investment.
Yeah.
That was really, yeah. And so, I mean, happy to think more about it, but I think we've got sort of two pieces of information between those two charts, and just wonder if there's a way to kind of bring them together from the perspective of the homeowner. And I appreciate these two slides and this idea that as you're getting close to the end of the useful life of a piece of equipment, right, that payback period's a lot sooner because you were going to buy something new anyway. And maybe it's thinking about, I guess it's that we are moving at we are proposing to move at a pace, I think, that exceeds meeting people where they are at in terms of being at the end of the useful life of their equipment. And so which one of these scenarios sort of plays out over time, and how we can factor that into some of the ways we think about costs and evaluate costs I would love to dig in there a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a great point. I didn't mention, but we looked at it in the analysis is what if you're not at the end of your life on the furnace, and you've got, there are 5 or 10 years left, and then you're looking at an upfront cost, which is the entire cost of the heat pump, and you do eventually get the fuel savings. I think, but it takes longer, and so you need more help covering that upfront cost if you're going to accelerate the transition. Yeah.
Yeah, and I thank you. That is much better words than I was able to get to. And I think understanding how that then intersects with rebates and ways we could use the proceeds becomes really important to see what that sweet spot is, and appreciate that a lot of this looked at 2030. I guess my takeaway is that 2030 doesn't appear to be particularly achievable under the programs that are in front of us. So can we use some of the information you've produced to help us get a sense for how we could balance those investments and kind of meeting people where they're at in terms of system replacements? But thank you. There's a lot of really incredible information here. I did have a second question, which I hope is a little bit easier, which is you talked at the end about a reporting only framework, and just wondered if you looked at what is currently required under our Affordable Heat Act in terms of reporting requirements, and are able to make recommendations about things that are missing beyond. I know it doesn't include transportation fuels, but we're doing some of that work and would just be interested to see how that aligns with what you think would be important to have in order to inform program design for a cap and invest.
Yeah, it's a great question. We have not looked at that closely. And Brian, I don't know, you're probably familiar with those reporting requirements and how much they might align. I'm not sure. But I will say that, we've certainly, want to align any requirements as much as possible so that, you're not duplicating effort.
Yeah. So, Jared, let's go with your hand, and then I'd like to switch gears into public comment. And apologies, folks, we're a few minutes late on the public comment. But Jared, go ahead.
Thanks, David. There was just one clarification I wanted to offer from the kind of introduction and context setting, which is, and I think sometimes we talk about the emissions reduction obligations in the Global Warming Solutions Act as though they're sector by sector, like the transportation sector would need to reduce its emissions by this much and the thermal sector by this much. I just want to remind folks that those are really reference points, because the Global Warming Solutions Act only has statewide or economy-wide emissions reduction obligations. There's no specific target for each sector in the Solutions Act. Kind of achieving emissions reduction in proportion to each sector's source of pollution or the amount of emissions it's creating is one of 8 considerations that the law tells the Climate Council to consider as we craft the climate action plan. But I just want folks to keep in mind the difference between a reference point for sectoral reductions versus an actual kind of firm legal obligation on the economy-wide or the statewide emissions reductions. Another thing I wanted to offer, just going back to Secretary Moore's first question from the introduction, which I think is a really good question, and it's a fair point, this question of when you link with other states, how sure are we or not that the emissions reductions would happen here versus elsewhere? And I think that Secretary Moore brought up a good point that it's possible that there could be a difference between those. I would just suggest that it's possible that the difference works in the other direction, i.e. that we actually get more than our statewide share, our proportional share of reductions in Vermont than elsewhere, because I think the opportunities are different. I think, if you look at the industrial sector, some of these larger states that have a larger industrial sector, more obligated parties, they likely have more opportunities for cost-effective emissions reduction in their industrial sector. But if you look at some of our other high-emitting sectors, I think it's probable that Vermont has greater emissions reduction opportunities from a cost-effectiveness perspective. One thing, for instance, is that Vermont is especially dependent relative to either California or New York or Washington or Oregon on fuel oil and propane, which have, per unit of fuel burned, have higher emissions than the heating fuels that those other states have, which is a higher proportion of fossil gas. So I think that there's different opportunities in different places, and I think it's worth further questioning about how those would line up and what that would mean. But the last thing I want to just say is, in terms of a key takeaway from this study, I want to make sure there's so much good information here, and thank you, Mark and Chris and teams. But one thing that I think is really important that I don't want us to lose sight of is that one of the most important takeaways from this study is that it is possible to design Vermont's participation in a cap and invest program so that Vermonters with lower and middle incomes are not just made whole, but come out ahead and save money. And I think it's important to note that there are two ways that we can do this, and you can maximize that benefit by combining them. On the one hand, we can do that by using the revenues from a program to provide direct rebates to Vermonters below a certain income level. On the other hand, we can also use some of that revenue to prioritize incentives to help lower and middle income Vermonters overcome the upfront cost hurdle that Secretary Moore was just talking about, so that folks can access more efficient and lower cost energy choices that reduce dependence on high cost fossil fuel systems and help them lower energy costs over time. And those two components are each really important, but I think they're especially powerful when paired together. Rebates to make whole lower and middle income Vermonters, and then prioritized incentives, because those are the folks with the highest energy cost burdens and who have the biggest hurdle to overcome to help achieve energy cost savings over time by getting off of fossil fuels. And I think this program, well designed, could allow us to do both.
Thanks, Jared. Appreciate that.
David,
Okay.
it's Chris. I can't raise my hand. I don't know how to do it.
Sorry.
Sorry. I can ask a question now, or I can ask it later. It's not a long one, but just tell me what you prefer.
I'd prefer to do a little public comment right now, Chris, and then circle back to counselor conversation if you're going to be here for the next end of the meeting, the next hour or so. Is that all right? Okay, cool. All right, so I'd love to switch gears into public comment, and folks can do what Annette and Bram just did. Raise your hand in the Zoom. If you're having a hard time doing that, you can drop a note in the chat to me, or make your comment in the chat. And the way we're handling public comment these days is we're going to do about 2 minutes each, or no more than 2 minutes, I'd say. And we've got 20 minutes to do public comments, so we'll go just right to the top of the hour, maybe a minute or two past. And if folks still have hands up at the top of the hour, we'll give you a signal how to provide that comment. We've got an email, we've got comment forms, we've got different ways for you to get in contact with the Climate Council. 2 minutes, folks, appreciate that, or no more than 2 minutes. Happy to do shorter if you'd like. And Annette, you're first up. Go ahead, please.
I appreciate there are a lot of ifs here. So if the emissions benefits accrue to other states, what incentive do the other states have to have a state like Vermont join?
Let's keep that as a question and answer that together as we get back. And I'll ask Chris and other folks to take note of these questions as we go. Thanks, Annette. Bram?
One request and one question. The request is, when we look at projected numbers of created jobs or net jobs, when it says we're gonna net create 100 new jobs, it would be really helpful to me and possibly others if we knew the two components of that, how many jobs lost and how many gained, because losing 20 jobs and gaining 120 jobs is a very different transitional question than losing 5,000 jobs and gaining 5,100 jobs. In either case, you end up with 100 net new jobs, but in one case, you have 5,000 displaced persons that you have to arrange a transition for, and in the other, you have 20. So that is the request in the future. And the question is, the projected savings of health expenditures, was that were those Vermont specific numbers?
Again, let's keep these. I'm making a list, and those are great questions. Is that Vermont specific numbers on the health expenditures? Thanks, Bram, for those two questions. Matthew LaFleur?
Yes, I have a good question. And this is a big one. And it goes to Annette's question too as well about states, because there's a business agriculture business profitization with this model. Most states will charge other states to be join their coalition. It's just how it is. Business is business, you know. The question is that would it be, feasible knowing the working components, of this, climate captain invest, whatever region we choose, would be most beneficial if we do it in our own selected regions. I meant, you got the Western region and you got the Eastern region. Like I said, Eastern region is like us, we're New York, etc. Would it be feasible, cheaper to stay in our regions than trying to venture out, knowing that the cost is to join a different region could be higher than would be if we stay in our own selected regions. That from a business standpoint. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. And thanks everyone. I see Chris in the chat, like answering things that are quick and easy to answer. My idea here is let's pull some questions together and then we can have some common answers as we get to the end here. Earl Hatley, welcome.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate the presentations. I have some question about the emissions trading, if that's not the right term, but I understand there's a cap and trade and a cap and invest, two scenarios within this. I want to focus on the cap and trade and would like to have that fleshed out a little more, how that works. And also, I keep seeing in the slides the auction, but I don't get what you mean by auction to start this all off. So I'd like to have that explained as well. And thank you for the great presentations.
Thanks, Earl. Yeah. Stephen Dodge, please.
Hi, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity. Three quick questions. One is, we know that in all the states that have cap and invest programs, that they also have complementary and successfully complementary LCFS programs, Oregon, Washington, and California. And I think it's generally recognized that those states, those programs work better together than they do individually. So I guess my three questions would be, did the study take into effect, the LCFS portion of the study take into effect the immediacy of carbon reductions? There's a reason now that it's easier to find non-fossil diesel in California than it is fossil diesel, and that all 12,000 plus diesel engines under the jurisdiction of the city of New York are using biomass-based diesel. We know that it's cost effective, that in most cases retrofits aren't needed. And whether you call it a bridge or not, you immediately begin seeing carbon reductions. And I'm wondering if the study took that in consideration. The second question I have is there was a slide that talked about revenue generation, again with the LCFS, and that there was no net impact. And there may be no net impact to the state, but there's sure going to be an impact to industry. And again, we go back to California, the largest generator of EV infrastructure and rebate monies have come from the LCFS program. I think it's billions and billions of dollars over the course of the program. And most of that money, the money generated from the LCF credits have gone to the electricity sector, charging rebates, so forth and so on. That's the second question. Third question is, I question about prices. I'm looking at a slide now that CARB put up not that long ago saying that there is no relationship between LCFS credits and retail gas prices. So I guess I would question the 10 or 10 to 30% figure that was put out there, because it appears to be not the case in California. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Adam McGeary?
Yes, hi. Thanks everybody for all your great work. This is a really informative presentation, and you'll forgive me. Before I was an attorney, I was an elementary educator for a very long time. So I just want to be clear about something for all folks and think it would be beneficial for the public generally. The social cost of carbon is a really particular kind of term of art that I think would benefit from some further elucidation in terms of what it includes, and just giving a little bit more flavor for how that's kind of accounted for in this cap and invest program could be really helpful. And I think it would give a lot of people some additional kind of data to chew on as they're reflecting on this program. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Adam. Other comments, questions from folks who've been listening into the conversation today? I've noticed some things in the chat as well. We can record those, make sure we have them. Okay. Before we jump to a break, I think while these questions are still floating around in the air, I wonder, Chris, if you and I can do a little back and forth real quick on these questions.
Yeah.
And I was writing them down as well, so hopefully between the two of us we can go through them. Chris, the first one, this question about, depending on where emissions accrue to, like, are there really incentives for states to join other states? That very first question out of the box. Chris, did you have a thought on that?
Yeah, well, one thought that I have is that the bigger the market is, the more opportunities there are to look for cost-effective emission reductions. So it's just, it'll be a benefit. And then in terms of potentially lower prices for the same kind of overall combined emissions cap. So it's just kind of economies of scale. Again, you can just look for the cheapest place to reduce emissions. I think that's the major benefit.
Great. And Chris, the issue of who gets to count the emissions reductions, has that been a big issue in the work you've done?
No, I think, California is definitely, taken a life cycle approach to emissions. I know they have kind of state targets, but it hasn't, that concern about emissions potentially being out of state, it hasn't come up in terms of, I think, anything we've heard in terms of, linkage discussions.
Great. Okay. You answered in the chat the question about the health benefit amounts, and that is Vermont specific. The first question on that was a request, and I don't know if you have it handy, of breaking out job gains versus job losses rather than just having a net number. If you have it handy, great. If not, it's a we'll get back to you kind of moment.
Well, we don't have that specifically. I do know that the study looked at job changes by industry, and it wasn't a very detailed. It was like 20 industries, so it is not very detailed. But I think the only places that we saw net losses were sort of in the retail industry with the. I think you'd expect to see some decline in gas station revenue, and I think what you would see is those losses, rather than just being like all at one time. I think they would be over time, and so I think in terms of transitioning, it would be a relatively small effect, and also something that maybe. But I agree that it's important to kind of look at where those industries might be affected and help transition.
Thanks, Chris. There was a comment about this, are there financial reasons, economic reasons for staying closer to home versus farther afield? Like, does geographic location make a difference here?
I don't think it does. Again, I think you're looking for the most cost-effective places to reduce emissions, and that if it's anywhere, if it's in New York, if it's in California, if the resources for the future folks have a thought on that and want to weigh in, certainly welcome that.
Yeah, I would just say that people worry a lot about what we call leakage, which is like emissions reductions being offset by increased emissions other places that don't have the policies. And the closer you are, probably the more trade you have. And so keeping the competitiveness even between two bigger trading partners versus smaller trading partners is probably important. But we ship a lot of stuff across the country, and so I can't even necessarily say that Vermont is a bigger trading partner with New York than it is California, because it's a big country and stuff moves around everywhere. So it's just, the bigger that your trading partner, the more likely you want to link with them.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah. And to the extent you have prices aligned across borders, that's maybe helpful if, if there's concerns about people driving across the border to buy gas in a different state.
Correct. Yeah. Okay. There was two interrelated questions. Someone wanting to understand a little bit better about the trading aspect of this, as well as the auction aspect of this, and what's actually being traded and what's actually being auctioned, and how does that work?
I'll try to take a start at this. So an auction is done by the state where they sell allowances, and there are rules for how those auctions work. Who can participate, what the minimum bids are, and people auction, and you get a clearing price for the allowances. And so people are literally buying these entities are buying allowances through these auctions.
And Mark, can I just interrupt you for a second? When you use the word allowance, you're actually talking about an amount of carbon emissions you're allowed to put out into the atmosphere. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. To cover the emissions that are associated with your fuels or your business. And so, it is, people are, one company might say, I want to pay $15. One company might want to say $20. And, the market mechanism will work to, find the clearing price for, that the allowances will actually be sold at. In terms of the trade, there are secondary markets. And so people can trade these between themselves. And so you could imagine that a firm could buy allowances in anticipation of needing them, and then deciding they don't need them because there's a way for them to reduce their emissions. And so what they could then do is that in a secondary market could sell those allowances to a different company who needs those credits, those allowances, to cover their excess emissions. So, cap in and trade and cap and invest are, in my view, pretty similar terms. Trading is still allowed in cap and invest. Cap and invest really just means that you're using the revenues from the auctions to invest in further emissions reduction strategies.
Thanks, Mark. That's really helpful.
And
I want to go to the
David, I
top
just
of the
want to
hour.
add that it's
Oh, yeah,
really
go ahead.
important to acknowledge that we already participate in the Cap and Invest program with Reggie. We have like a long experience with participating in the auctions with regional partners, and accruing the revenue and distributing it as well. And if folks want more detail on exactly how that works, I'm happy to take those questions offline.
Thanks, Brian. That's really helpful. And if folks want to get in touch with Brian, just ping me, and I'm happy to make sure you guys can link up. Just a few more things at the top of the hour. We'll head to a break, but there was a couple questions about the sort of pairing with the low carbon fuel standard and the impact of that low carbon fuel standard and the immediacy of those emissions reductions, and also the question about funding and the connections between the low carbon fuel standard and actual fuel prices. I remember those it was like a trio of questions. Chris, do you want to take a first stab at those?
Yeah, and I think some of them are, I'll take them more as comments than questions, but the immediacy of emission reductions, that is a good point, that, that's really fuels that can be substituted, just drop in fuels. At least that's one of the ways that you can meet that standard. And so, that is a benefit of the low carbon fuel standard. In terms of, providing revenue to support electricity, yes, absolutely. Again, the state is not making decisions about how the money from those credits is going directly towards the agencies, the entities that sell those credits, but that can be utilities who can invest it in electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So yeah, or incentives. That's very important. In terms of the CARB study finding no relationship between credits and gas prices, I don't know. There have been maybe a couple of different things that people have looked at that have found different impacts. There was also a study in Washington State that forecasted some modest impacts on gas prices, at least in the near term, but then past the early 2030s, it was supposed to reduce prices. But so, yeah, there may be some different results from different studies on that.
And that's specific to the low carbon fuel standard as opposed to cap and
Yeah,
invest.
exactly. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, great. There's a few more things in the chat, but I think what I'd like to do is take a break. We've been going for a while now. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back and we'll do two things. One, I'll pick up a few of these questions in the chat and we can do another Q&A a little bit rapid fire like what we just did now. And then counselors, I really want to start to wrap our heads around the so what and how to make sense of all this in terms of the types of things you may end up wanting to recommend. All right, so let's take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 10 minutes past the hour. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to try to pick up some of these questions in the chat when we get back. We'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay, so we're back from our break. Thanks, everyone. Sorry to make that so short, but we'll be finishing up the meeting by 2. Okay, before we jump back into the council, I do want to take some of these other questions that came in through the chat. There was a question, a follow-up question from Earl about carbon emissions from biofuels, and understanding how that would work in a low carbon fuel standard. And then we can pick up on Chris's question in a second, and a few questions here on another chat that I'll get to in just a second. But Chris, if you can just a quick question on the biofuels and how that gets dealt with in low carbon fuel standard. You're on mute, Chris.
Sure. So the way that emissions are accounted for is different under a low carbon fuel standard than under cap and invest. Under cap and invest, Vermont, at least the way that Vermont's emissions accounting systems are currently set up, doesn't count biofuel emissions as against its cap. So basically, when you burn a biofuel, it emits the same emissions as a regular fuel or similar emissions to a regular fuel that it's replacing, if you're talking about like biodiesel. But you also have upstream in that production, you've got uptake of emissions when you're going to plants to make that fuels. So, but a lot of states like Vermont just say that biofuels don't have emissions under their accounting system for in-state emissions. A low carbon fuel standard is a life cycle standard, so it does include all the emissions associated with producing, transporting, and burning that fuel, as well as any net uptake of emissions in the when the crops are grown. So, sorry, that was maybe a complicated answer.
No, that's really helpful, and appreciate you diving in there. And then just a few other these. A clarification in the modeling when you refer to a high cost scenario, is the 60-cent cost assumed to be implemented from day one, or did the modeling also consider a graduated increase?
Yeah, good question. And we probably didn't make it clear that we are assuming that Vermont is a price taker in whatever program they join. So Vermont cannot set its own price. The price is set by the market that the state joins. There is not currently a market where that is trading at the high cost level. So we do not have a program that we could join right now that would be trading at 60 cents. It's possible that over time the Western Climate Initiative could get up to that level. But anyhow, since Vermont has no influence over the price, we also are unable to do a graduated increase or ramp up, although there are other ways of ramping ourselves into the program. For example, starting off by giving all the money back as dividends, and then kind of over time ramping up in investment.
Got it. Okay. There's a request here about showing a graph that, not to do in real time, but it'd be helpful to show a graph that shows the price volatility of fossil fuels over 10, 15 years. So you can see what a 30-cent or 10-cent change would look like against that. That's a request in the chat. So for future presentations, maybe that would be helpful. And also says Vermont currently has an incentive program, Switch and Save, that is targeted to low-income people. That is a great illustration of what we could do more broadly with the significant revenue that would come from Cap and Invest. It might be good to include it as an illustration. Okay, so I think that's everything from the chat except what Chris Campany put in, and I'm worried Chris isn't on the phone right now because he had to take a drop off for a second. But Chris's question was related to Julie's question, right? Which is that sort of capital cost of the equipment cost of doing the upgrade. And Chris has been a constant advocate for putting in the cost of upgrading your electrical service as part of that, which is not cheap. And he's wondering if that's baked into these numbers as well as all that cost.
Yeah, I mean, we took some scenarios that were kind of looking at, I think, New York or just kind of regionally for different households. They looked at scenarios with different households with different sort of investment needs, including some with electrical service upgrades. So I think that the cost can be characterized as maybe partly covering those, but not fully. Is just taking an average look. So yeah, some households would have higher cost because if they needed to do that, others the cost would be lower if they didn't need to make those upgrades.
Okay. It sounds like overall it'd be helpful to sort of tease that out of the sort of the equipment costs versus operating costs and understanding how that plays out over the initial years of the program. Okay. Great. So I wanted to just jump to counselors. And as you think about the recommendations you would want to make or how you would want to frame that up, both in the draft recommendation you'll make going into the end of March, and then the final one, what does this make you think, right? When you hear all this presentation, what does this make you think about what you'd like to put down on a piece of paper as your recommendation? Rich?
Well, I actually have a couple of questions that
Okay.
will help me to understand. The first is dealing with an assumption that I've had and a lot of other people have had, that Vermont would not want to do a cap and invest program just on its own. And the assumption, as I understand it, has always been that, well, the market would be too thin, we're not big enough, and the administrative costs would be too high. But I'm asking the experts here to advise on that, because in terms of the market being too thin, if we were to do a cap and invest scheme, a lot of the emission reductions are going to come from the invest side. And we want those things to happen in Vermont. So we want the market to be focused on Vermont. So I'm going to just state that as my first question. My second question is about the low carbon fuel standard. And I would ask again, the experts to think about this. If a low carbon fuel standard would be an efficient way to go for the transportation sector and reducing emissions, is it also an option for the thermal sector? And considering that a low carbon fuel standard for transportation expects that the emission reductions are going to come partly from drop-in fuels like the biofuels we've been talking about, and partly by supporting investments in electric vehicles. That's what a low carbon transportation LCFS does. Couldn't a low carbon fuel standard for the thermal sector support those same things, including heat pumps rather than electric vehicles?
Okay. So two questions there, Chris. One is, are we sure Vermont doesn't want to go on it on its own? And then the second one around imagining a low carbon fuel standard for the thermal sector.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the second one, and Mark, someone else might also want to weigh in on the first one. But definitely a low carbon fuel standard is expandable to thermal fuels sector. I think one of the reasons why it was maybe contemplated just for transportation in this study is that Vermont had also been contemplating a clean heat standard, which I understand works differently. It's not directly on fuel intensity. It's more about kind of equipment replacement to obtain equivalent emission reductions. But certainly, other states have low carbon fuel standards that go beyond transportation, and so definitely, no reason you couldn't do that, for other sectors as well. In terms of not going it alone, yeah, I don't know. Again, small state, potentially higher market volatility, and certainly a more administrative burden on Vermont to set the thing up. I'm not saying it's completely impractical or unfeasible, but I don't know if others on a team have opinions about that.
Before we jump to others on the team, Chris, can I just also follow up based on what Rich said? This idea of the benefits and where the benefits go, right? The investment. I think I heard you say earlier that it doesn't matter where the emissions reductions happen, the benefits flow proportionally.
That's right. Yeah.
State. So I just want to clarify that point.
Yeah, thanks.
And Rich, and make sure that there's not a miscommunication there about that.
Well, I'm gonna guess I'll have to respond
Sure.
through the observation that it does matter where the emission reductions come from, maybe not in a global sense, but in a cap and invest scheme, the investments will be made in Vermont because the auction revenues will be in Vermont. I don't expect that Vermont is going to look around the whole world and look for the cheapest place to reduce emissions. We're going to invest those dollars in Vermont. And so the invest side, which is reducing emissions in Vermont. So it does matter.
Chris, this is above my pay grade, so I'm going to extract myself from this back and forth. But Chris, if there's some answer to that about the difference between what it means to have money to invest versus.
Yeah, and I agree with Chris that in terms of where obligated parties might reduce emissions, they can reduce them in a variety of ways. But I don't expect that the state of Vermont is going to invest auction revenues in New York.
No, I think, yeah, I think, right, whether Vermont joins another program or goes it alone, I mean, we're still going to invest the revenues here in Vermont. In terms of, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought, but Mark, maybe you also had a response to that.
So, I mean, the biggest argument for larger programs, like linking with other states, is price stability. And larger markets will have just more stable prices, and will be less reactive to shocks. So that's the biggest argument for that. In terms of whether or not Vermont goes alone or Vermont goes with a group, they are selling allowances for a specific price, and Vermont is putting those allowances out and selling them. And one of the benefits of cap and invest is that you can take those revenues and invest them in more emissions reductions in Vermont than you would have gotten just straight through the price signal. So, that maybe you could call that a benefit of the invest approach, is that you can target, specific Vermont reductions that you above and beyond what you would get just from, putting a price on carbon.
And Mark, does that make a difference whether Vermont goes alone or Vermont is part of somebody else's program?
No, because Vermont is selling, whatever, 3 million metric tons of allowances. And so there might be a price effect. So if the price is lower or higher based on Vermont's participation, but we anticipate Vermont's probably pretty small relative to these other ones. So we expect that if New York is selling allowances for $20 a ton and Vermont joins, the $20 a ton will be the market price. And so Vermont adds in 3 million metric tons, and then they're the one, Vermont is the one collecting the revenue on those allowances.
Got it. Okay.
And I'll just add, David, I agree, of course, Mark. Like primarily, it's market volatility, but it's also to capture the lowest price emissions reduction. So the broader the market is, the more opportunity there is to achieve those emissions reductions at the lowest price. Of course, Rich, there isn't any structural barrier to Vermont standing up its own program, except for then we would be doing it all our own. We wouldn't have the opportunity to have the benefits of the trading markets that we know are beneficial because we participate in them in one now. And if you just were trying to raise revenue, then really the simplest way would just be doing it with a carbon tax versus trying to stand up a in-state cap and invest program, like Mark says, with a limited number of players and with a relatively limited number of opportunities for emissions reductions. But yeah, it's a choice. It certainly isn't impossible, but it is that choice of, do you want to be in a broader market, or do you want to incur the the complications of standing up your own program in order to be able to run the whole thing and do all these other things, like we would set our own cap, we would set our own price ceilings. That's potentially a benefit that you don't get if you're doing it, if you're participating in a multi-jurisdictional program.
Okay, well, we could have a long conversation about this. And by the way, I agree that with Reggie, because we have a regional power market, it makes total sense to have a regional cap and trade, or cap and invest in our case, market. But for energy efficiency, for example, we run our own statewide energy efficiency programs. We don't feel the need to be involved in a multi-state efficiency market in order to find the lowest cost efficiency resources anywhere in New England. We just run our own program. So, and if we consider that a lot of what we're trying to achieve here is to transform end uses in Vermont, then it makes sense to me to focus on policies that transform end uses in Vermont as our principal objective.
And there's more than one way to do that. And yes, efficiency markets are different, but I think like the fuel markets for transportation and for heating fuel are regional markets, not identical to electricity, but we don't exist in isolation in that market.
I want to make sure we get Dahlia's question. And so Dahlia, I don't know if it's faster for you to say it before you jump, or you want to drop it in the chat, but I want to make sure we actually get your question before you have to jump to class. There it is.
Yeah, I have to go right now, but I just left it in there. If it doesn't feel super meaningful to the council to discuss, no worries, but I just put it in there. I have to go. Thank you so much for this. This is very educational.
Thanks, Dahlia. Okay. All right. So someone else, maybe someone can read through Dahlia's question and ask it on her behalf, counselors. In the meantime, are there other reflections, like Rich's reflection of like, hang on, are we really sure about our assumption that it doesn't make sense to go it alone, right? Are there other questions like that that folks have, or some thoughts about how you want to integrate this into your priority actions and priority recommendations as a council? Any thoughts? Joey?
I can read Dahlia's question.
That'd be great.
Sure. Because my point is sort of related. First off, I have very little expertise in this and I found this meeting very educational, so thank you. In considering the concept of meeting people where they're at, do we anticipate that this will be relatively easy to understand and catch up with for people, industries, businesses, et cetera? How might we ensure this / could we consider interweaving some form of education into our CAP when integrating a CAP and invest program? Even after learning from this meeting, I know that I, for one, have a lot more to understand. I'm sure this would apply to many other Vermonters. So it's a great question. And I guess part of my question, just to build off of that, is in terms of how we might want to consider making a recommendation or not. I feel like we need a little bit more context before answering that question. I mean, it may be helpful for people to get a deeper dive into the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and see what, how that has worked. It's different, but relevant. Cap and Invest program. What are the benefits, costs, et cetera? It also, potentially could be helpful just, as a reminder, people are probably aware we had recommended joining the Transportation and Climate Initiative before it fell apart in late 2021. Vermont had been at that table considering that Cap and Invest program since 2010, I think. Anyway, so we've been considering and pursuing such an approach for a long time, but have not actually moved forward to implement. So I think we have a lot of good information to build from, and sort of maybe more further table setting would be helpful. And some recommendations I had made before, looking at other states who are implementing the program, how's it working for them? I wonder about hearing from them to inform our conversation. So just want to put that on the table. And then also, several people have made this point, but Secretary Moore, you really were elevating this, which is, there's the barrier of upfront investments for people. Because for a variety of reasons, including the fact that we've radically subsidized the fossil fuel industry for generations. It's cheaper than a lot of the alternatives, although cleaner energy is becoming increasingly cost competitive, but the upfront investment for the technology is a barrier. And I think we all recognize that. So part of what I'm interested in and want to just pose to the Climate Council is, this potential program is intended to drive particular outcomes, but it's not the panacea. I would really love to see us sort of making recommendations and doing due diligence around financing, for example. What kind of structures could we be putting in place to help Vermonters overcome those obstacles? And I don't want to look to the electric sector again, Liz and others, knowing that we have regulated our electric sector for good reason and with good benefits. But I do think about things like on-bill financing, where, if we want people to electrify, are there financing strategies that, help defray that upfront cost hurdle, but still enable people just to pay monthly bills, So I would want us to think about what kinds of recommendations or work would we like to see or recommend to wrap around a program like this to help get, to help answer and solve for some of those legitimate challenges that I would love to see us sort of breaking down the barriers to. So David, long story, I'm not ready to answer your question, but I don't think we make progress without a program like this. And I think we need to actually figure out what we're going to pursue so that we can serve Vermonters better than we are at the moment. Thanks.
Thanks, Joanna. Thanks, Joey. Yeah, and I feel there's two pieces in that. One is the recommendation around wraparound programs and particularly financing. And the other is, do we need more table setting? And this is something that you, as a steering committee, talked about last week about whether it would be helpful to have another meeting, maybe an extraordinary meeting just of 60 to 90 minutes where you could hear from other states. And so it's something we want to check in with counselors. And in a moment, I'll do a little checking on the chat to feel like how all counselors are feeling about this, but it's something the steering committee wanted to test with you all as a council. Would you want to hear from someone from California, from Washington, someone from New York, Quebec, and just get a little more flavor about what it feels like to deal with these programs? So think about that for a second. I'll check in the chat about that. Jared?
Thanks, David. Yeah, I agree with Joey's suggestion. I also want to suggest that I think that there are some additional clear next steps that are worth considering and that at least I personally would support. Well, first for context, I think that one of the things that this study shows, and that every study we've seen has shown, is that it's unlikely that any single program or policy will get us all the way there in terms of our emissions reduction obligations. But that this approach is one of only two, a cap and invest approach or a series of performance standards that could significantly reduce climate pollution in line with our legal obligations and do so while prioritizing cost effectiveness and equity. So I think no single program can get us there, but I don't see how we get there without a well-designed cap and invest program. And so I think the first step would be to look at, and this goes back to an earlier question, how do our existing reporting requirements match up with the reporting requirements of the fossil fuel importers and sellers that would be necessary for us to be able to join the Western Climate Initiative, or if it gets off the ground, the New York Cap and Invest program. I think that's step one, is understand what the reporting requirements would be to join one of those programs and look to establish them so that we have that option. I personally, went into this process agnostic or undecided about Western Climate Initiative versus New York. Over time, I've become much more interested in the possibility of joining with the Western Climate Initiative states and provinces. Primarily because it's an established program that gives us more confidence and clarity. There have already been a lot of delays with the New York program, and we don't know if it's going to stood up, or if it even did get stood up, how what challenges it might face. There are certainly pros to joining with New York, but I think WCI has existed for more than a decade. And it is a ready and available option that is very much worth considering advancing once we've got the reporting requirements. And then the third thing that I think we should consider working into a recommendation about joining a cap and invest program, I do think it's important that we cover multiple sectors. For folks, the reason that this started as a transportation only study is because we had the context originally of transportation cap and invest, the TCI program, that did not end up moving forward. But because of the existence of that program at the very beginning of the climate action plan drafting process, it nudged us in a sector by sector approach. I don't think we're in that box anymore. We can achieve greater cost effectiveness and equity if we're covering multiple sectors under a cap and invest program. And then the last thing that I think is really important in terms of a recommendation is that we use a significant portion of the revenue to provide rebates to make lower and middle income Vermonters whole. And then with the remaining amount of the rebates, prioritize incentives for lower and middle income Vermonters to overcome the upfront cost hurdles so that we can end up with with greater energy savings, especially for those Vermonters who currently have the highest energy cost burdens, who are, primarily lower and middle income and who depend on high cost fossil fuels like fuel oil and propane and gasoline. So that's kind of where I'm at.
That's great. I really appreciate all those thoughts. Okay, so we're at a time where I need to transition. Dave, I see your hands up, but I think your question was answered in the chat. And I just want to stick with the council for a second here. So counselors, could you just throw in the chat with a yes or a no or a Y and an N, whether you'd like to schedule up another call, call it an hour and a half, where we'd get a panel of folks from different states and we could get into some more nuance and understanding. So drop that in the chat, counselors. If that seems like a good thing to do, we could schedule that up in March. I'm seeing a bunch of yeses so far. Don't hesitate if no's is where you're feeling. But so far, I'm seeing some yeses. But yeah, counselors, could you just throw in the chat if that seems like something helpful to schedule up in 90 minutes with some other states, get some more. Or maybe in April, March, April. We'll see what we can do with the timing of that.
Yes, for me, I can't type.
Okay, thanks, Chris. All right, so the yeses seem to be carrying the day on this. Be able to ask questions in advance. Thanks, Rich. Yep, that's helpful. Okay, great. And Secretary Moore, you have a hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask what in order to move forward with a cap and invest, I guess there are two paths, right? One is there's the work that's going to happen in the legislature, potentially in response to the treasurer's recommendation that should come out next week. And then the other is what the council may or may not do as part of the next climate action plan. And I know we've spent a lot of time in this space trying to figure out how we navigate schedules and calendars that don't completely match up. But I do want to make sure there's sort of maybe one conversation being had around cap and invest that involves all the relevant parties. And it feels like the council going way deep, not knowing what the legislature intends to do. I'm not sure it's the highest and best use of our time. Just flagging that, but certainly appreciate the majority of folks indicated that further presentation would have value.
Thanks, Julie. Okay, fair. And I think, as we've seen, there were some legislators listening into the call today, and I wonder if we can take steps, you can take steps at council to help have conversations all together. We are close to time needing to switch, but Kelly, I'll grab your hand.
Yes. Seeing how many people attended this meeting, I sense that there's a really big interest from the public in these questions. And so my hope is that having a short additional meeting, probably after the treasurer makes a recommendation, sounds like that'd be good timing, but having a short additional meeting that helps people get a better sense of what this is all about, because a lot of us, I think, are left with more questions, lots of things answered, and yet more questions. So this would be helpful, I think, for me, but also probably from the sense I get of the size of this meeting for the public in general.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah. Yeah, so it sounds like doing this after the treasurer makes a recommendation, which is going to be soonish, I understand, but definitely after, and something that hopefully can also link up with other folks who are debating this in the legislature and elsewhere. Okay. Thanks, everyone. I want to say a specific thanks to Chris and Mark and everyone from the teams, the consultant teams that spent time with us today on this topic and did this in-depth report. So thank you. Thank you for that. Rich, concluding thought before we finish up here?
Thanks. Yeah, just one point. I would say I'd endorse a point Jared made a few minutes ago. Regardless of what path we choose, we are going to need a reporting system in place. And getting going on establishing a reporting system is something that I think the council should include in the climate plan.
Okay. Thanks, Rich. Yep. Okay. So there's two more things we wanted to do before we sign off at the top of the hour. One is, as we often like to do, or we try to do in every meeting now, is if we've received input, public input through the comment form or other ways, Sophie likes to present that to us. And so we wanted to give Sophie a moment, and also I think she'll talk a little bit about the latest quarterly engagement report as well. And then we want to spend at least 5 minutes or so talking about what needs to happen between now and our next meeting. Sophie, if you are here.
Hi, sure am.
Good to see you. Do you want to share your screen with something?
Sure thing. Let's see, I think I can do that as well.
Or just tell me what to share and I'm happy to do it.
I've got it through my. Let's see, is that coming up for others?
Yes.
Yeah,
A
okay.
little hard to read, but it's yes.
All right, let me zoom in a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks everyone. This quarterly report covers October through December. We shared out with you from Liz with the meeting materials. And we're just getting to sharing it with you a little more in depth now because we had such a big in-person council day together the other month, which is great. There were a couple of events attended the past quarter, so hopefully everybody's gotten a chance to read through this. If you haven't yet, it really doesn't take too long, and I definitely would encourage it. So I'm just going to review it in a really broad sense, not read through specific things, but there's some comments from the Missisquoi Festival in Swanton, visiting the Interville Fair Share Distribution Day and talking with Vermonters there. There's a link here to a larger summary from a conversation specifically about the Climate Action Plan up in Winooski with linguistically diverse community leaders. That was included in the large engagement packet that you all received about Climate Action Plan input. Same thing here, another focus groups we did specifically with Capstone Community Action in Barrie, Vermont. And there's also the input sessions that happened over the fall, which again, those were also included in your big engagement summary packet back in November. Some other things that happened over the past quarter, Vermont Energy Education Program hosts a weekend retreat every year. So we went with the support of the youth counselors and led an engagement activity and workshop. Really appreciated their support in that, sharing their experiences with other youth who are involved in climate action. We also are starting development of a measuring and assessing progress tool on climate action. This is something that's named in the Global Warming Solutions Act. So there's a focus group held on that. We're continuing that this quarter, and results from that will be shared in the future, but are not summarized in this report. And then if you scroll through, you'll get a couple other sample quotes. For the purposes of today, I'm going to stop my share. I thought I would just read out a couple that didn't make it into the report from the Interville Fair Share Day. Climate Action Office and Consensus Building Institute heard a couple of these quotes. Transportation to get Burlington residents out to Brill, Vermont would be helpful. The need to go back to simpler living, that climate change is bigger than us and our thoughts impact it. Advocacy for Vermont needing more public transportation, which would help with commutes. Someone who is a resident of an assisted living community noting that their windows are not stormproof, the insulation is very bad, and they use the weather strip, but that will often freeze. Another resident of a senior living community noted that the place that they live is net zero. A person who co-owns a foraging business noted that the gardening climate zones are already changing, and that affects them. And then another comment that you all received with that email from Liz was a memo on the Clean Heat Act from Chuck Gregory of Springfield. So that was a couple pages. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but I'll read this short paragraph that summarizes what his public comment was about. Says, from an environmentalist point of view, clean heat standard will not suffice unless it motivates the public to inculcate as new behaviors for choosing and using sources of energy. From a policy point of view, it is advisable to offer the strongest possible incentives for the public to do so. This paper posits that the two strongest incentives are, number one, significant savings in the household budget, and number two, exercise of personal choice and personal responsibility through the universal availability of heating fuels at no cost, up to the limit of 75% of average annual heating cost. So those are some comments that round out the things that were shared with you. And then one final note is that also in Liz's materials, the Municipal Day notes were included. That was from back in November, and that was That was supposed to go in your engagement summary back in November, and I missed including that. So my apologies. It's a 2 or 3 pages long and summarizes some more input from municipal officials and volunteers.
Nice. Okay. Great. Thanks, Sophie. So you have these things in your email from Liz, and it's helpful just to remember that it takes a little bit of time to go through them. And any questions, Sophie's the best person to always ask. Counselors, any questions for Sophie about sort of what's come in? All good? Okay. Thank you, Sophie. Appreciate it. The last 10 minutes of this, I'd love to spend on thinking about the work ahead. And Liz, is Jane here by any chance or not yet?
Yeah, I think Jane's here.
Okay. And Liz, could you pull up either the writing doc or sort of what's going to help us talk about the next steps here?
Yeah, if folks can. Okay, yeah. Okay, great. Yep, I'm happy to start going through this. So as we're in the drafting phase of the climate action plan, I've shared out 2 materials, this being one of them, the guidance for drafting, which really gives an overview of the approach and expectations for writing the chapters, noting that they're generally short, but that there's this cap outlines assignments, which is really to pay attention to the word count. And we'll go to that in a moment, but that's going to be really the guidepost, noting here that COL will cut to meet the word count, but without changing the content or meaning. And also just reminding that we do have the initial climate action plan and to utilize that to draw from, and also that some chapters are new and so are not going to have that. But also just the approach to writing the story narrative about the chapters and not having to include necessarily like the table of actions, but to refer to them in the narrative. And then the rest of this document really outlines formatting. So for folks who did do the initial climate action plan, this is going to look very familiar, just so that we are all on the same page about that. The second document that I want to show folks is the table of contents and drafting leads. So the outline assignments. Here you're going to find the various sections, who's responsible, and we have updated word counts since I've sent this out. So I'm going to send an updated version of this. And while going through this, I just want to note that I will be reaching out along with Sophie to certain draft leads, understanding that folks have been writing these drafters already, with some having a March 1 deadline. So we'll be working in partnership to make sure that word count works with the current progress that's being made and having to make adjustments as needed. So you will expect to have see an email from me this week about that meeting. So that's really next steps, is focusing on this drafting part of the plan.
And that March 1 date is shockingly close. And so I know that several counselors are meeting together in groups to try to pull some thoughts together, also to react to some of what we spoke about in our last meeting. I want to just check with counselors who see their names on this document. Does anybody have any questions for Liz or others about what's expected in the work ahead? Any questions from counselors, particularly if you find yourself looking at your name here in a March 1st deadline? Any doubts? Okay. We'll be working with the steering committee to create an agenda for our March 10 meeting that really feels like a deep dive into the content. And we'll be using 2 things. We'll be using those chapters as a core content for us to give meaning to our priority recommendations, and we'll be going deep dives into our priority recommendations. And so We have time on I'm saying March 10th. Is that the right date? We have time on March 10th. It's going to be a 5-hour meeting. We can design exercises that really get us into it, and really focused on the output for the month of March, which is draft content that we're ready to share by the end of the month and do public engagement and different kinds of engagement in April. All right. Any thoughts, concerns? Liz, anything else you want to say about next steps? Or Jane, if you're there, you want to jump in? All set? Okay. Counselors, any thoughts on your minds before we wrap up? Any final reflections?
I would just note, this is Carrick, David, I just would note that I can only see that document. I apologize if I should have it somewhere else. Down on the screen, down to health. So if I don't have any assignment below there, okay, but I just want to be clear.
Let me see if it's linked right now to the meeting. And if not,
It's linked, but I'm going to send out on the chat just so folks can easily get to it.
even
Thank
better.
you very much. Thank you.
There we go. That's it.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Anything else?
David, I got a quick question, and
Yeah.
not to revisit or relitigate, but just because I don't know that I was around when the drafting process was decided. Was that decided by the steering committee or the council, that like the counselors would be drafting the sections of the plan, as opposed to consultants or climate action officers? Summary, how that came.
Yeah, I mean, I'll do a poor job of remembering the exact history, but the essence is for several months we've been going. Oh, Jane can do it, but Janie, there?
Yes. Yes, I'm here. Yeah. I mean, that document has been a back and forth with the steering committee, and really it was a evolution of first looking at the original table of contents from the first cap, thinking about what would come forward, what would change, and then really an intentional shift to try to push the total page number and size of the cap this time around down to a smaller, more comprehensible document. And then an acknowledgement that the Climate Action Office is here to provide administrative support and really pull the plan together, and could draft chapters where there's maybe not as much interpretation of voice to like push a recommendation, et cetera, but really chapters that are going to have a voice of the council. In other words, chapters that make recommendations should really be led by counselors. And so yes, I think we've said this before in past meetings, but just to say it again, counselors are lead authors, but please obviously draw on expertise if you need it from subcommittee, state staff, if you have questions or need support in drafting it, even though you have your name next to it, there's capacity there to help support your drafting.
Thanks, Jane.
Hopefully that helps. Yeah.
Kelly, did you want to jump in? Are you all set?
Oh, I was going to say exactly what Jane said about the fact that, my name is next to this chapter from Just Transitions, but a ton of other people on our subcommittee did the majority of the work. And so it's just having somebody's like signing off on it in the end, who's like part of the council, I think is the idea behind that name there, but it's not the only writer of the chapter.
Yeah. Thanks, Kelly. All right, folks, do reach out if you have questions. You're for any kind of struggle, particularly around the writing, just let Liz, Jane, me, somebody know, and we'll figure out how to be supportive. Happy Monday. Take care, everybody. Have a great week, and we'll see you in March, if not ahead of time.